So back in March 2021, when we launched our very first episode, we spoke with my very good friend Michael Mullin, who talked about his experience with mental health, and we thought it was about time that we brought Michael back to the podcast. So I'm going to introduce and say a big hello there to Michael Mullin. Hello.
Hello, how's it going?
It's good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be back. It's crazy to think that that was only just a year ago that we did that first episode, and it's crazy how long it feels at the same time. It feels to me, having listened to the subsequent episodes, that this thing just feels like it's been going forever now. You've got so effective at what you're doing, and it feels like such a staple within my social circle on the Isle of Wight. And to see the sort of success that you guys have had with Island Minds from that starting point where you were just like, hey, do you want to speak to me about mental health and stuff? And I was like, yeah, sure. I didn't realize how much it would grow, and people are listening in different countries for some reason to an Isle of Wight based mental health talky thing, which...
That is our tagline. Mental health talky thing.
Exactly. And I think branding like that is what's making it a winner, to be honest. But looking back at, because I listened back to the first episode today to sort of remind myself and reflect on the things we covered back then, I think you said something along the lines of, oh, just a silly podcast on the Isle of Wight isn't going to be enough to make change and all of this. And it's awesome to see that we kind of hinted at, but everyone needs to start somewhere. And maybe this for some people could be that turning point where they start to think more and a difference starts to be made. And I would argue that that is the case already. So well done, you.
Thank you. It's definitely been an interesting year because obviously when we started back in March, mental health was very much at the forefront of the media because of the pandemic, because of COVID, because of the rise in awareness. And it's been really interesting to track that in the media over the year. And I have to say the podcast itself has been received really well. We've had really good feedback, which is lovely. You know, at no point did we ever set out to give, you know, unsolicited advice or give people bad advice or the wrong advice. It was simply to give people an opportunity to talk, and we didn't really know if that was something people were going to want to listen to. But over 700 downloads, 18 different countries. We were expecting maybe 100 downloads like in a year. It's two people in their living rooms with cheap equipment talking. So it's it's been very interesting. It's been a big learning curve for us as well, because obviously there's subjects that we need to research on before we can talk about them, really, because it's actually, even without giving advice, it's quite easy to say quite damaging things or quite dangerous things that people might find quite triggering or might interpret things. So it's been good, but a huge learning curve.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things I have noticed, I mentioned in the last episode that we did that I'm a student mental health nurse at the moment. So I'm obviously another year into that now, and having been placed a couple of places on the Isle of Wight, working with service users and with the other people providing services, that learning curve never goes away. Obviously, I'm a student at the moment, so I'm expecting to be learning new things every single day, which I am. But as someone who has been a service user and is still myself, from that side of things, you're constantly learning more stuff about yourself, about what there is to help, about what other people can do for you, what you can do for other people. And all of the professionals are all constantly learning. I think that's actually a big thing that would help everybody, whether you don't feel like you've experienced something you would describe as mental ill health, whether you suffer really badly, whether you have in the past. Everyone could embrace this idea of learning new stuff all the time, because that's the only way we're going to make progress, I think, and it's going to help everybody out to just be open-minded and embrace and pursue learning new stuff. There is something that I think about a lot. I'm not hugely present on social media, but obviously some big trends or headlines do pop up. I see a lot of stuff that you post about mental health news, and I sort of get an insight into what's sort of happening in the world, what the views on the subject are quite a lot. And I often wonder if we've made really good progress now, especially after the pandemic, in mental health awareness. People in general are becoming very, very aware that mental illnesses are a thing, a real thing that happens, and that taking care of your mental health in general is an important thing to do. So we're very aware of it now, but more mental health education might be the next most important step, because there's a lot of people I know who have tried to help and speak to me when I've been very unwell. And there's a big sense of, I know that you're struggling and you're suffering, but I don't have any idea why or how or what I could possibly do. And that it makes it difficult for people to reach out and help people who are struggling, because it's rare that they are going to reach out themselves. And if you don't feel like you know how to start that conversation, it can be very stressful for you as well, because they're your loved ones or someone you care about. So of course that's going to stress you out. So yeah, just a conceited effort to try and learn as much as you can constantly, because there are no real answers. It's always going to be changing, but embracing that idea of seeking knowledge.
I think that's a really good point. There is a lot more awareness now, and generally people are aware that mental ill health exists. And like you say, there now probably needs to be a big push in education, so more people are aware of what they can do, how they can notice the signs, and what is actually helpful in that situation. But equally, there is more awareness, but awareness doesn't mean that people are more accepting. It doesn't mean that the stigma has gone anywhere. People may be more aware of it, but what you're still seeing, across all social media platforms is just a lack of empathetic approach. People still have the same stigmatized views that they had before they were more aware of it. So awareness is great, but I think it does now need to change and adapt into something that's going to be more useful.
Yes. You mentioned a great word that I hear constantly at the moment in empathetic, and empathy, and something called unconditional positive regard are really key things drilled into us as student nurses that are like core values of being a nurse. And the more and more that I learn and progress on the course, the more that they're just kind of values I tend to practice in everyday life, because I don't see any good reason not to. So unconditional positive regard just being it's essentially just assuming the best in anyone and everyone. We're very, very quick to jump to conclusions about people, or start to think about why they might be doing something or feeling some way before we even talk to them, before we even get to the point of asking them what's wrong or how they are or what they're doing or why they're doing it. We're already forming these sort of unconscious biases about what we expect them to say. But if you come into every interaction with unconditional positive regard, you come in with the assumption that they're a good person, that means well. And So whatever's wrong, whatever's ailing them, or whatever's making them do something that maybe you don't agree with, come in assuming it's not their fault.
Yeah.
And then work from there. Perhaps, but everyone's not a lovely person. Perhaps someone doing something bad, it is their fault, but there's no reason to go in ahead of time assuming.
Wouldn't the world just generally be a better place if people had, I really like that, unconditional positive regard. It's just a really nice term.
Perhaps it would be a better place. I like to think so. I think empathy, gosh, I could go on forever and ever about the state of our society and the way we approach interacting with each other. But more empathy and less us versus them in general would probably be very healthy. Like I said, it's great to hear you mentioning that term just casually, because obviously, like I said, I have lecturers banging on about it, and Carl Rogers and his humanistic approach to psychology and stuff all the time. So it's like a buzzword for me, but to just hear it be a normal thing that people talk about when talking about approaching mental ill health is pucker, because that education as well as awareness is obviously spreading.
I think we do see now in sort of everyday language, we're seeing more and more usage of words such as empathy, mindfulness. It's becoming more and more rooted in everyday. It's still got a long way to go, but I certainly hear mindfulness and empathy a lot more than I think I did pre-lockdown.
Mindfulness, obviously, another big thing that I know the NHS and a lot of charities and organisations and mental health professionals are pushing as being such a useful and effective tool for anyone to practice in life. So all of the stuff that we talk about and that you and all the other guests have talked about in all the other episodes, it's all just a very complex balancing act the whole way along. You've got all of these tools and techniques that you can use, but you can't lean too heavily into any of them because that could cause its own problem. So everyone's individual. And again, you're always learning and you're always changing. So perhaps it's not always going to be viable to practice mindfulness in a certain way. Perhaps you do need to do something else at this point. So it's a balancing act and it's constantly changing. So no wonder people struggle all the time. It's a difficult thing.
Balance is important, and I think going into this sort of new world where we are asking people to be more mindful of, more empathetic towards mental ill health, it's okay for people to make mistakes. It's okay for people to be ignorant of these things. It's asking people to be open-minded, to listen, to take on, other people's experiences, and to maybe embrace it with more of an open-minded approach than perhaps they previously had. But it's absolutely okay to make mistakes. It's absolutely okay to have misconceived ideas. That's fine. That's human. It's then how you move on from that, how you sort of, what you take away from what you learn.
Yes, and that, as many people know, that the process of making mistakes is often the best way that we do learn stuff. So if you do think or say or do something wrong and then recognize that, that's going to be a very powerful tool for you to learn not to do it in the future.
Yeah.
And improve in whatever regard that is. I guess we should talk about boys, since that's what we are.
We should, because so as a female podcast, we're very conscious that there are perhaps sectors of this that we are not the best place to talk about. So having you on here, it would be really good if we could talk about men's mental health.
Yeah, I did notice, as I said, I re-listened back to what we talked about the first time around last year, and it was mentioned, we touched on men's mental health briefly, and your statement was, there's so much there to unpack. We could do a whole episode on men's mental health, and now a year in, we're doing that. I also noticed, I was doing a bit of self-reflection. Within the first 10 seconds of me introducing myself, I talk about having dealt with depression and anxiety. And then I said something, I said I had dabbled in alcohol addiction, but I wouldn't call myself an alcoholic. And I even clarified this. It wasn't because I was afraid or ashamed of being labeled that term, because there's a huge amount of stigma to the term alcoholic. Anyway, but that wasn't what was concerning me about saying I was one. I said, I know there's people who have it much worse, and so I shouldn't complain there. And I thought, just in 10 seconds, that was a good example of me, even having accepted that I struggle with my own mental health for a long time, seen so many professionals about it, learning to be a practitioner myself. And so I've got this huge wealth of understanding and knowledge and all of this. And I overrid all of that with the concept of man up, don't complain about it, because there's other people that have got it worse. So just keep it to yourself. Even on a platform where you invited me to come and talk about my own mental health issues, I decided it was more important to be a man and shut up about it.
Do you know what? I hadn't clocked that, but you literally invalidated your own experience in that sentence. Wow. Good reflection.
Yeah, well, it wasn't very hard. I made it. It's almost like I set myself up for this by being so blatant with it right off of the bat. But it made me think about something we'd learned about quite early on in my course, the idea of schemas in your brain, which is, in layman's terms, the processes which your brain learns to deal with information and to deal with situations, rather than coming to a situation and working it out from scratch every time you encounter it. You have these little processes that you've used in the past. So each time you see a zebra crossing, you don't have to go, what is this? What do those lines mean? You go, I remember that cars are going to likely stop here and I'm going to be able to go across the road. That's a very obvious one, but there's a lot of these schemas that society and the way you're brought up embeds into your brain, and they are amazingly difficult to rewrite or overwrite. We're very good at creating new ones, but it's very, very hard to unlearn something like that. And these, you can be given new information. You can be told, oh, you should talk about how you feel more as a man to your friends, or you should go to a therapist or something. But we don't just process that blankly, we process it through our schemas. So because that's just how the brain works. So we're not given this new information and said, oh, okay, I should talk more about this. We go, okay, they're saying that we should talk more about this, but it's going through the filter of, I'm not allowed to talk more about this. So that's very confusing. And that is very stressful for a lot of people in general. And as you had said, statistics have shown that it's a bigger deal for men because there's so many obvious things and pressures that we are slowly, I believe, starting to move away from, but things that create these schemas, like the term man up, the idea that men have of having to be providers for the family, the idea that they have to be the strong one, and the idea, like I mentioned that I did, the idea of not having to burden other people with your problems. You, as a man, should be able to deal with them yourselves. And I'm certainly not saying that any of these are the right way of thinking. And I'm not also saying that any of them are bad ways of thinking. There's a lot to be said about being strong and independent and dealing with your own problems, but they are not the only lens with which we should view life and everything that gets thrown your way. Because it obviously leads to some pretty cataclysmic trends that we see across the nation and globally. I didn't know if you had any specific statistics that you wanted to go through, but
these weren't necessarily surprising to me this time round, searching for them for this podcast specifically. But I remember last year when I was watching Roman Kemp's documentary, Male Mental Health and Male Suicide in particular, I was shocked. That I remember being shocked, and I think it's not that I'm not shocked by it, it's terrible, but it was not surprising, which I guess in a way is bad as well. The two that I picked up on in particular, this is from the Mental Health Foundation, just as a source. So in 2018, there were 6,507 suicides registered in the UK. And in 2019, there were 5,691 registered in England and Wales. And of these, 3/4 were among men. And this has been the case since the mid-1990s. So this is not a new... trend is the wrong word. But this is not a new statistic. This has been a problem for quite some time. And the other statistic that I found... men report lower levels of life satisfaction than women, according to the government's National Wellbeing Survey. I mean, there are lots there that kind of follow the same. And while women are more likely to be diagnosed with a problem, men are more likely to follow through with things such as suicide.
Yes, and that is the big factor and the big statistic that on this topic we are taught about when training to be a nurse. Unfortunately, I believe the most recent statistics from 2020, 2021 have had an even more downward trajectory. So we were told that a man is roughly 4 times more likely to take their own life, complete suicide at the moment. And in general, when you look at public health, so sort of the well-being of the population on a national or global level, mental health services, certainly in the UK, are judged solely on the number of completed suicides in the country that year. And they have been going up steadily. So we recognize as a country now that we are in a crisis, because our main goal in mental health is to reduce that number, and it's steadily going up. So something is wrong. And so big changes are going to have to happen. Now, obviously, we're coming off the back of a pandemic, which it sparked, among other things, this whole business starting, recording these podcasts, and it's raised awareness, and obviously that is going to affect the well-being of people's mental health in the country. But it seemed likely that we were headed towards this crisis regardless of the pandemic. There's so many different factors. Obviously, the financial situation in this country is a mess at the moment, and that plays heavily on these sort of statistics. And there's a lot of problems, especially when you look at the men's side of things, with that higher likelihood of actually following through with taking their own life. The information age that we live in, when you've got all of these schemas that I talked about before, about what it means to be a man, and you're brought up aiming towards that goal. When you're a boy, you want to grow up and be a man, and it's seen as a good thing still. But then there's so much changing in the world, and it's often, I imagine, hard for people to recall what it actually means to be a man, especially when a lot of things associated with that gender identity are now being somewhat demonized or somewhat looked at as just negative character traits that can play on someone's mind, especially someone who is predisposed to not talk about this sort of stuff and just process it all through in their head. It's hard for me to think of an exact example, and I'm not saying that some of the things that men are known to traditionally do aren't problematic. It may be good that the idea of what a man is does change somewhat, but it can't be expected for people to have been brought up thinking this is the way they should be.
Yeah.
For us to turn around and say, no, stop doing that. That makes you a bad person. It's going to take time to adjust to that. And it can lead to situations where men lose sight of what they should do, and there's a sense of hopelessness that obviously comes in there. But yeah, the statistics are awful, and generally speaking, what we can put it down to is that on average, men are much less likely, as we said, to talk about the way they feel or seek help for it. And this extends, interestingly, beyond just mental health services. Men are much less likely to seek help for any sort of physical illness either, rather just wait it out and just hope for the best. And it's really interesting to look at the reasons for all of these things. Women are, from what we can see, looking at it in terms of anthropology, we're going into all these different lenses and sciences now. Women are predisposed to interact with the medical system much more because they tend to spend a lot more time in it, regardless whether people who are mothers, obviously you spend so much time going in and out of hospital, interacting with doctors, and so many other things throughout your life that I don't know anything about, but female physical health is a lot more involved. There's a lot more interaction there in the first place. And so it doesn't seem like such a big leap to go to your GP if you feel like something's wrong. And all of this sort of stuff going on in people's heads, stopping men from talking about things or seeking help, it means that when they do reach out, it's almost always in a crisis situation. And that is very difficult for mental health services to deal with, because preventative measures are not only much more effective, but a lot cheaper and a lot easier for the NHS to manage than reactive measures.
Yes.
If someone has been overwhelmed and is feeling like they want to take their own life, then they perhaps would have to be brought in for constant observations, which means that's a bed in a hospital, and there's only a limited amount of that, and that costs us a lot of money to provide that to someone. Whereas if they had, in the lead up to that breakdown, if we had caught it ahead of time, maybe we could prevent it from getting worse, and then that cost didn't have to exist in the first place, and that strain on an already strained NHS means that even more people could get the treatment that they need. And it can be tied to any situation that anyone has. If someone is overwhelmed and they turn to drugs, if they smoke loads of weed because it helps calm them down, then they have too much and have a psychotic episode because of it, then they need to be brought into a ward, and the follow-on effects of that can be massive. If you are assessed under the Mental Health Act during a psychotic episode as not having capacity, then you need to be sectioned and brought into a ward, and you have to stay there for a significant amount of time. There's a minimum amount of time you would have to stay if you're assessed as needing the treatment that was there. And that can have an effect on your life when you leave the ward. It could affect your job. I think it can affect whether you can get in or out of the country and whether you could drive. There's certain specific rules for the period of time immediately after you've been discharged from a psychiatric inpatient ward.
Wow.
So the follow-on effects, it seems a bit insignificant at first, where you're just like, oh man, you should talk about your feelings a bit more. But when you look at the big picture, not doing that seemingly insignificant thing is having, like, how much more evidence do we need about how big of a deal it is that this 4 times more men are taking their own lives because they go down this path and don't see any other viable option. It's so, it really is upsetting to think about that we've got these schemas and these thought processes. They have so much power over us that I've had a hard time fairly recently. I've been particularly unwell over the last couple of months. And as I said earlier, having the great position I'm in terms of being able to look after my own mental health, I'm learning all this stuff constantly. I'm engaging with all this stuff. I have a cohort of like 50 other people all learning the same stuff that are incredibly supportive. I have an amazing network of friends. I'm connected to a wellbeing team at my university. I've worked with inclusion in the past, so I have all these professional and personal relationships. I have a wonderful girlfriend who's very supportive and understanding of all this. And even with all of this stuff, I was in a position recently where rather than talk to anyone about that, I'd rather make an attempt on my own life. It's so ingrained in some guys to avoid troubling other people with our problems that in the moment it seems like a better option to try and kill yourself, which is baffling to look at in hindsight. And obviously, I don't need to go into detail about why that's a bad idea, the permanent solution to a temporary problem and all that business. But gosh, yeah, it makes sense at the time, which is a scary thing. And so the fact that you said having a surprising amount of people who are men coming on to just your podcast talking about these sorts of things is so incredibly powerful, because like with any piece of media that anyone absorbs, we know that it's important for there to be representation, so that you can identify with someone and like, oh, they're like me and they are talking about this. Maybe I could do that as well. I think it's probably very easy for men to get overlooked when thinking about representation, because we dominate every other and films and television and sports and corporate thing. Men are just overrepresented everywhere, so it's hard to think of guys as the sort of underrepresented, hard done by minority. But in this very specific niche, that more or less is the case. It's what the evidence is telling us. And with all of this big picture stuff, looking at public health, and like I said, the government recognizes that we are in a crisis at the moment. When looking at how to tackle that, you've got to identify the problem areas and groups and cater to that specifically. If you're going to address any public health concern, the first thing you do look at is usually women and children, because if you're going to try and make generational changes, you have to make sure that new mothers and newborn children are going to grow up in a more positive environment. But I hope as we move forwards that the new policies that the NHS and government legislation makes, they take note of how overwhelming the evidence is that shows that men are a problem area, a problem group that need to be helped specifically.
They need to be included. It's all very well talking about new mothers, and as someone who's about to become a new mother, I've seen a lot of this. There is a lot of focus on the mental health of the mother. There is a lot of focus on the environment you're bringing the baby in, but the dad is very easily sidelined in a lot of that. Men have to be included in these things, because if they're not, the crisis will inevitably deepen.
Yes, that is going to have to be, it seems, a structural change as much as it is a change that is the responsibility of men as individuals.
Mm.
We are talking at the moment about the fact that guys need to talk about this stuff more, and they need to seek help, and they need to do this or that or whatever to make sure they take care of their mental health. But what we're unpacking as we discuss this is that it's incredibly difficult for guys to do that. So just telling people, you need to do this, you need to take care of yourself, isn't going to make the change we need. In fact, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. So the state or the services themselves need to step in and make that easier and take that responsibility off of the people themselves, because really that's causing more and more of a problem than anything else. And I'm not sure what the exact routes can or will be for that in terms of structural change. I hope that stuff like this, just talking more openly about it and embracing that concept of learning through sharing this information. You'll learn from other people that have had struggles with their own mental health. You'll learn from people that work in the field. You learn from people that have no idea what, as far as they're concerned, they have no idea what they're talking about, but they just give their observations. That's valuable as well. So the more people that do manage to make that leap of speaking out about it, hopefully it'll have a snowball effect. Because yes, it's noticeable when you look out and you do see, like you said, people talking about this stuff on social media and the engagements that you get. It's usually mostly women that are responding to those things. It's very anecdotal, but I remember seeing, I think it's a post that either you made or had replied to about medication, antidepressants, I think. I don't think, I know. There was basically lots of people singing the praises of sertraline, which is a fantastic medication. It's usually the first, in the first instance of a depressive or anxiety disorder, that will be what's prescribed as standard. And I saw lots of people talking about, oh, it's good, it was better than this thing, it was better than this. And I, as a man who have had experience with taking that, I'm like, yeah, but your dick can't get hard when you're taking sertraline. So it's all well and good, these people saying, oh, sertraline's great, like, this is the one you should go for. And men, I didn't speak up. I didn't say anything about it because it's embarrassing and it's emasculating. But then men might see that, go to the doctor, start taking this medication. Oh, now I have erectile dysfunction on top of the fact that I was depressed in the first place. And boy, does the idea of having erectile dysfunction play heavily on a man's mind and on how at least he thinks other people perceive him. So in a lot of cases, going and taking that specific medication could make things a lot worse. And just having that sort of perspective put into these dialogues would be very helpful, because then at least a guy could go see his GP, talk about medication and be like, I've heard sertraline can have an effect on your sex life. Is this true?
Yeah.
And they'd be like, yes, if you're worried about that, there are other options, because there's a huge load of options, and different stuff works for different people.
Yeah, and you're right. I believe it was a post I put up about medication, and I think all of the responses were from women. And you're quite right, they were all singing the praises of sertraline. And I guess when we read through the side effects, or the side effects we experience, we're not going to then be mindful of how that may be different in men. I mean, until you've now just enlightened us, that isn't something I would ever have considered. But what would have been really great is if a man felt like he could have jumped on that thread and said, well, from my perspective, just so you're aware, I would ask the question, how do we change that? How we can even make small changes from this level.
Yeah. It's, as I said a little ways back, it's very difficult to see what the path is in terms of a bigger picture, what the solution is. Luckily, we do have entire sections of the medical field and the government that are supposedly working specifically on coming up with a plan of action for stuff like this. So, and unconditional positive regard, there's no reason to think that they're not going to do their best to come up with something that would be effective. So that I can try and take hope from. The biggest thing on an individual level, the fact that we're having this conversation is, I think, the best thing I can suggest. And it's very difficult to adjust your mindset as any human being when you're starting to feel down or unwell, or it's very difficult to adjust your behavior or your coping mechanisms or stuff when you're in that state. Perhaps looking at the flip side of things, when you are feeling well, having a look at your mindset and how you see yourself and how you see yourself as a person, and what your aims and goals are. What do you actually want to achieve? Because I think this is more universal, but in our culture, there's very much we aim to succeed at stuff. We aim to win at life, get a good job. We want to be financially stable, and we want to be, generally speaking, in a relationship and have a family and all of these things. And very few of the goals that people set for themselves are like, I want to be happy. That's not number one. So people, if it was, then maybe that wouldn't be sacrificed for the pursuit of a better job, a promotion. Oh, I need to work harder and neglect my well-being so that I can get there. And if I hit that point, then I will be a better person. I will have succeeded, and that will make me happy. When really, if you're not setting that happiness, or at least that state of contentness with your life, if that's not the goal you're aiming for, it's never just going to happen as a byproduct. That's what you've got to work towards. And so if you do that when you are feeling up to it, then that changes your whole approach to life and your mindset, and will hopefully help in those times where things start to feel worse, because it's part of those schemas that you're putting into your brain. If how you process things are, the end goal is that I want to live a happy life, and I want to be in this state of mind where I'm productive and I feel good about life. That's the main thing I'm aiming for. Then speaking to someone about the fact that you're having these troublesome thoughts or something, it's no longer getting in the way of your goal.
Yeah.
And with men, sometimes that goal is to, I've got to appear to be strong. I've got to be the man. I've got to have this great job where I'm a provider. That takes precedence over, I need to be happy and well-functioning member of society. So just change our mindset and how we look at things. If that was my first thought, what would make me happy when reading your social media thing about medication when I was on my way to a lecture about mental health? If I was thinking about that, maybe I would have chimed in with, no, it's a great drug, but it does have some pretty shitty side effects for men, so maybe keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Because I know it makes me feel good to spread awareness about this and to maybe help other people. But what overrode it then was, that's embarrassing. I don't want people to see me as a limp-dicked loser, so I'm not going to come in with that.
There is definitely going to be an e-warning on this episode.
Sorry,
it's all right now, because now it opens up the possibility for, you know, all sorts of language.
But yes, that is, in a big, long-winded way, the thing that I think can help the most. And it kind of ties together a lot of the stuff I said when we started about embracing everything being a learning process. So if you're doing that, then the idea of changing a mindset becomes less scary, because you're constantly learning and you're constantly changing the way you think, and adjusting the goals that you set for yourself in life, not to lesser goals, but just thinking about what ultimately is more important and what ultimately is going to have a bigger difference. Because I'd say if you aim for happiness, then all the other things will probably improve.
Yeah.
Because if you're feeling well mentally and emotionally, you are more productive, and you are all these other things that were your initial goal. I want to be productive and successful. They can happen as a byproduct when happiness evidence doesn't support that can happen as a byproduct. You hear all the time about people with all the money in the world that feel awful regardless. On that train of thought, in terms of mindset with goals and outcomes and how we think about them, I've learned a lot about the idea in the mental health sector of working towards recovery as opposed to working with recovery as opposed to treatment. So if you think of treatment, you think, I have a problem, I'm going to get treated, and then it will be cured. And then things will be great, and I won't have to worry about that anymore. Whereas recovery is just a journey from point A to point B, where point B is better than point A.
Yeah.
And that obviously looks very different for different people.
Yeah.
But in the long run, it's so much more productive, because things don't always go perfectly well, and there are no cures for, as far as I'm aware, any sort of mental disorder or any sort of low mood or whatever. It's just something that you work on continuously until it isn't overwhelming you anymore.
What you've pointed out there is language is so incredibly important, and the language that's being used sort of en masse in publications and literature, it's so important that is correct, because that is what ultimately filters down into everyday conversation eventually. And you're quite right, treatment brings with it its own sort of connotations, but for many people that have been through the mental health services, you'll know that it is about management and recovery rather than cure and that's it, bish bash bosh, done. It is about living with and being able to manage so that your quality of life is greatly improved by your own healthy coping mechanisms, because we know that there are some truly terrible coping mechanisms that many of us have sort of help or we go into that. So yeah, language is so important, and it's one of the things that we're quite conscious about on this podcast. There have been a couple of episodes where we've gone back and re-recorded bits, because actually the language we were using, while innocent, could help to fuel certain stereotypes of certain illnesses. But that's something that we're obviously learning ourselves that it's very easy for these things to come into everyday conversation. And obviously in the podcast, we have the ability to edit, but in everyday conversation, you don't.
That's, the importance of mindfulness that you mentioned again right at the start. We're bringing a lot of stuff full circle is key. Yes, what you say and how you say it does matter.
Yeah.
And these days, if you're typing a status or something to put on social media, the words that anyone says can be very far-reaching. It's not like just having a chat with someone at a pub in person. You can reach a lot of people, and you don't know what level of knowledge they have about the subject. So they're going to read from your words whatever they're going to read. So it's best to be mindful of what you're saying and give the best possible chance for the right meaning to be gleaned from what you're saying. There. I said so much stuff in a big long diatribe there. I'm not really sure what any of it was, but yeah.
I was like trying to find the right point to say, "Are you okay?" Like, are you okay? Because obviously you have talked about your very personal experience. So I kept trying to want to say, "Are you okay? Do we need to take a?"
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to say that. I noticed I dwelt a lot on. I'm not sure if the vibe coming in was for me to talk about my personal experience, but listening back to the first episode, I did quite a lot of that. And I wanted to maybe look at a broader picture this time. And then I was describing a situation in general about guys, and I'm like, this is just me. I did this just now, and it feels stupid to be like, hypothetically, if this happened, someone might do this. When I'm like, someone definitely would, because I just did.
That was but it's interesting, isn't it? Again, because we're talking about men feeling like they can be more open and encouraged to talk about personal experience, but there was still, I know you did do it, but there was still that almost hesitation to go into it hypothetically rather than as a real personal experience. But it's so interesting what you said about when we had you on here the first time, like invalidating your own experience because other people may or may not have it worse. I never clocked onto that.
It's always okay to express your own worries or fears or feelings, even if there's worse ones. The thing about talking about addiction and there's other people whose lives have been far more devastated than mine, I shouldn't talk about that. There's a lot to be said of people who are suicidal and make either attempts to take their own life and end up not doing so. Feeling like, I'm not really sure what the word is, being tentative about discussing that with people because you feel like, it's not really that big of a deal. If he really wanted to do it, he wouldn't be here talking about it now, would he? So it's a cry for help, or it's this or that, when perhaps a cry for help does, and in my case, happened after the fact of what I'd done. I'd cut my wrist after having far too much to drink. I'd planned to do it in the day leading up to getting drunk, and the reason I got drunk was so that I would be less scared of doing it. So it was a conceited effort all the way up to that, and it was only after having done it and seeing the blood and panicking that I then reached out to a friend of mine across the country in the middle of the night who was probably ruined his evening, as well as some other of my friends. He got in touch with some friends that live nearby in the Isle of Wight who, I don't know, it was like 1 a.m. or something, but they turned up at my door and helped me out immediately. So
I think it's important for listeners, there's a lot of myths around this idea of a cry for help being attention seeking. it's actually what makes a huge difference. So it shouldn't just be blown off. It was so important. It's so good that you did that.
Oh yes, I like to think so at the moment, that's for sure. It's
very good.
In that scenario, and I think a lot, I cry for help is quite literally what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
It wasn't, as I said, it was a planned event from the get-go, and I very pointedly wasn't saying anything to anyone about it at any point until I was in a state of panic, and then fight or flight kicked in. And it's just a response to that. I think it's quite damaging for people who are in a state where they're suicidal or have tried to take their own life, and not completed the suicide. It's quite harmful in any case to sort of diminish or belittle that state, because evidence obviously shows that people who have attempted suicide are exponentially increasingly more likely to go on to complete suicide. So again, unconditional positive regard. Just come into it thinking it's a very serious thing, and needs to be addressed, because there's no help in coming into that scenario and being like, oh, that person probably just wants attention. That's why they've isolated themselves for weeks and not spoken to anyone, and then said one thing to one person for 5 minutes. They're attention seeking. But it's a tricky situation. It's tricky to process all of that when you're outside of that person's mind. So that's why we're talking about stuff.
I'm very grateful that you have shared that. Obviously, there's never any expectation that people have to share very personal details, but the fact that we are talking about it, the fact that you have shared that, I'm grateful and thank you. Yeah, it's a super huge thing to talk about. I know that you know me very well, but it's still a super huge thing to do, to actually vocalize that. So I'm just, super fucking proud of you.
Cheers. It's a weird old thing, and it's very confusing at the time, and since about what, I don't know. It's scary because I'm still so unsure of what my plan, because I have done like self-harming stuff in the past, and that's separate from being suicidal. There's lots of people that hurt themselves as a release, because it's a very cathartic way of releasing overwhelming emotions, and it felt very similar to that. But then, as I said, I knew I went in planning the other thing, and obviously I wasn't in a good state of mind at the time, so it's hard to see, it's hard to know what I was thinking at all, which is like quite scary going forwards, because you're like, oh, I want to try and take measures to avoid that state of mind where I have no idea what my state of mind was or how I got there. So it's like, how do you avoid getting back to that? But yes, thanks for talking to me about it.